small amount and variety of food, and when there is an increase in disposable income for LDCs, more of it goes to spending on food. So an example is the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, up to 60% of every $1 increase in income goes to spending on food, so they can consume more and a larger variety of food. In DCs, where there is higher disposable income, people consume foods with health benefits like organic food, olive oil, and they consume larger amount and variety of foods. For example, is in Taiwan, where they are facing rapid economic growth, so they have reduced their rice consumption by half and have started eating 4 times more amount of meat. Food pricing also plays a factor. For example, the food pricing crisis from 2006 to 2008, where food prices rose rapidly and people in LDCs could not afford to buy food and to pay for the higher prices, and so they a lot of them had to suffer from chronic hunger and were malnourished and living in poverty. For DCs, although they are affected by the food prices crisis, but they are less affected because they can always opt for the cheaper food options. Social cultural, we have food preferences. We're talking about fast food chains in LDCs, because people in LDCs tend to opt for fast food chains because they're more convenient and they're cheap. And thanks to globalization, fast food has reached countries like India. But for developed countries, they are more educated. The people there are more educated, they are more aware, and they have the money to eat organic foods to preserve their health because they are more aware. They have increased awareness of the health benefits of organic foods. The population growth in LDC, there is rapid population growth, so the supply cannot keep up with the demand, and people have to starve because they have inadequate food to eat. But for DCs, there is a less rapid population growth, so there is a stable food supply and people have enough food to eat. Political situations such as civil war. So one example is the 2011 Libya civil war, where amount of food decreased as food stocks in the country were being rapidly depleted. An example of a natural disaster is the severe drought in Zimbabwe, where low rainfall destroyed most of the country's corn production. But unlike LDCs, LOTCs do suffer from political issues like war and natural disasters, but they have more facilities to cope with that. For example, they have facilities and places to conduct stockpiling where they save food for emergency situations and circumstances, and they also have they encourage local production, so more local people in LDCs, local farming. Farmers take up urban farming, and they have high technological tools. And DCs also have a diversity of food sources where they have stocks and contracts with different countries to increase the yield and the diversity of the type of food that they have in the country. Food safety is also under political reasons for various patterns in food consumptions between DCs and LDCs, where food security, we are talking about transportation of the food, whether food storage, if LDCs, they lack the knowledge and they lack the equipment to properly transport and store food, which lead to a lot of food suffered from diarrhea, from pneumonia, from malaria in LDCs, but also people in DCs are affected as well, because some of the elderly, they have trouble digesting food, and also people with eating disorders like anorexia, and all of these results in malnutrition. Starvation is also another consequence, where people suffer from a severe lack of food, and it's an extreme form of malnutrition where the body becomes skeletally thin, organs are damaged, and this all might result in death. This is more common in LDCs because there are a greater number of people living in poverty. A lot of people can't afford the food, and there are many political unrest situations like rebellions and protests that does affect it. So an example is Mali in 2012, where 5 million people were threatened with starvation due to poor harvest and rebellion. Inadequate food consumption also leads to decreased productivity, because workers, when they are malnutritioned, when they are starving, undergoing starvation, they tend to fall sick, and because of this they cannot come to work, and because they cannot come to work, the production rate of goods and services is decreased, and the company will suffer from losses. So this will ultimately affect the economic state and condition of the country. Also, children who fall sick cannot attend school, and this will lead to a loss in educational opportunities, which will affect their future employment, which will also affect the future of the country, the workforce, the economy, everything. And farmers, they do not have enough creative ideas and innovations to improve or to sustain their farming ways, and if farmers do not have enough nutrients, it will result in lower crop yields and lower food production, decreased food supply, because they are unable to implement improvements for farming. So all of these lead to an increased demand in health expenditures, in public health expenditures, because people demand more health services in order to maintain their health as a result of inadequate food consumption. And this will lead to lesser financial resources for areas such as education, housing, agriculture, transport, for the people who have to spend more money on healthcare services. This slows down the economic development of the country, but food aid and financial aid can be provided to countries who need the assistance. An example is USA gives financial assistance to countries in need of food aid, but requires them to purchase of supplies in the USA and transport through the USA ships as well. So this increases the purchase of food for these countries, as it is cheaper to buy from their own local food producers. So financial aid, this will lead a lot of the countries who borrow the financial aid from USA to suffer from national debt, because they are unable to pay back the people who have lent, the countries that have lent them a helping hand. Another consequence of inadequate food consumption is political unrest and instability. This is because when people are faced with malnutrition, starvation, low productivity, economic downfall, they lose their jobs, their loved ones die, and they want a better life for themselves, so they protest, they rebel, they protest, they rebel against the government. The government has to deal with these violent protests. For example, in Mozambique, where violent protests happened in Mozambique after the price of wheat increased. So this will lead to unrest within the people who are affected. And we are also talking about social impacts like scavenging, because some people are unable to get enough food, so it results in them scavenging through rubbish dumps. An example is Smoky Mountain in Philippines, where many people, residents of the slums, they results in them increasing and contributing to landfills, which also will both producers and consumers will dispose of food, and result in resources being wasted. Dieting is also a consequence because people might choose to diet if they consume too much food, and if they diet the wrong way, it will lead to organ failure and depression and a lot of other physical illnesses, mental illnesses with them as well. Okay. My back hurts so much. Alright, moving on to the second part of this. We're talking about factors affecting the intensity of food production. So the physical factors, like temperature, it affects the intensity because high crops that require high temperatures like strawberries, peas, broccoli, they require low temperatures in order to grow and thrive. But crops such as tomatoes and tomatoes and soya bean, they require warmer climates. So the optimal temperature for soya bean is actually 25 degrees Celsius to 28 degrees Celsius. And of course, crops require adequate rainfall, at least 2,000 millimeters of rainfall. So this is why they thrive in tropic regions such as Vietnam, areas like the tropics where the daily temperature range is between 22 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius, and they have high rainfall as well, on an average of 2,000 millimeters of rainfall, and they have long growing seasons, which will enable farmers to have many harvests, from like 2 to 3 harvests a year, which will lead to greater crop yields. And but areas with longer winters like Canada, they do have to suffer because their climate is too cold for any crops to grow. So they have lesser harvest because food production can only occur during warmer seasons. But to overcome this, a lot of countries like Canada, USA, Netherlands, they opt for greenhouses, where greenhouses provide the optimal physical environment for crops to grow, such as the optimal temperature, the optimal irrigation, and light. So they can control these in the greenhouse, so crops can grow all year round. Another factor of the climate physical thing that affects the intensity of food production is cattle and poultry, where when cattle and poultry are subjected to extreme hot and cold weather or unpredicted climate changes and conditions, then they will feel stress, which will lead to a downside collection, a decrease in the amount of milk and the number of eggs collected. And a lot of these animals, because of the stress that they feel, and they're more prone to diseases, so they die, which will result in loss of cattle. But to deal with this, cattle and poultry may be placed in shelters to protect them from the harsh weather. Soil and drainage. Soils and drainage is also another factor, because fertile soils are important, because fertile soils contain a lot of nutrients, and some soils and different crops require different types of soil. For example, oats require more sandy soil where the soil can drain the water better. But crops such as rice require soil that area where they have flat terrains and proper and abundant water supply with highly fertile soils to produce the most amount of rice yield. That's Mekong Delta, Vietnam. Relief is also a factor in climate and physical factors affecting the intensity of food production, where steep relief will result in a lower crop production, lesser crop production, because steep relief will remove the topsoil, which contains the most amount of nutrients, so this will affect the plant growth. However, crops such as grapes, tea and coffee, they require well-drained soil, such as steep relief. So, for example, Sapa in Vietnam, they modify the slopes through terracing to create flat land for farming. So as mentioned earlier, Mekong Delta, Vietnam also has a flat terrain to produce a high production of rice. Altitude is also a factor, because the higher the altitude, the colder the climate is, but only crops like strawberries and peas and broccoli can grow. Economic factors affecting the intensity of food production. We have subsistence, the purpose of farming. So subsistence farming is where production of crops are for personal use. So this is usually family labor, and they use more traditional tools to farm, and they have lower crop yields, and they usually produce staple foods like corn and cassava. An example is Sub-Saharan Africa. Also, there is commercial farming, where it's a large-scale crop production. They have more high-yielding crops. They have paid high labor, and they have larger land. Machinery like tractors are used instead of simple farming tools as used in subsistence farming. An example is in Asia. We can talk about the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Demand and capital, of course, as people demand more food has to be produced. An example is in China, which is a country that's facing rapid economic growth, so they require more food, and so the people of China recently, they demand more meat because the population is larger. It's a wealthier population. China is progressing, so more corn is needed to feed the livestock because they want meat. So the livestock that provide them the meat have to eat, and they feed off corn. So China has increased their local production of corn. Other than that, they have also increased export from the USA. So America actually transports a lot of corn to China, so that more livestock can be reared for meat. Agribusinesses, one example is Dole, which is a large banana fruit manufacturing company, and basically they do commercial farming. They have large scale farming and stuff, so they place importance on scientific and business principles like investing in the research and development of crops. So this really lead to higher, greater crop yields. They also have greater financial capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate We also have the agricultural policy, where governments can also decide how they want to dedicate their resources. So some governments, like for example in India, the Punjab Agriculture Department responded in 2012 to the need to ensure greater productivity from its farmland. So they have dedicated resources so that farmers can apply the knowledge to intensify their wheat crop production. So farmers were taught about best available seed varieties, pesticide treatments, and irrigation methods to, improve their wheat production. And we are also talking about government policy, agriculture policy. We're talking about food policy as well, where basically governments, they decide how food is processed, packaged, distributed, purchased, and everything. So the first thing we mentioned before, we have stockpiling, where the government sets aside some food to keep in case of an emergency so that their country will be okay. But we also have diversifying our food supply. So an example is in Singapore, where they used to only buy vegetables mainly from Malaysia, but now they have expanded to buying vegetables from USA and China as well. Also, NTUC, they do purchase vegetables from, they do have direct contracts with Indonesian farmers, and they do purchase their crops from Indonesian farmers beforehand, and they have a contract for it. So this, through importing food from different sources to avoid relying on a few countries, buffer against food shortages and price fluctuations, this is diversifying food supply. An example is the ASEAN Plus 3 Emergency Rice Reserve, where 3 of the biggest ASEAN countries like China and Thailand, they do contribute a lot of rice. So they have contributed the ASEAN Plus 3 Emergency Rice Reserve to contribute tons of rice, and Singapore has contributed $100,000 plus to this plus 3 emergency rice reserve commitment. So Thailand started the program as well. And the last factor that we have affecting the intensity of food production is technological. And we're talking about the Green Revolution, where corn was not indigenous to Africa, but because of the Green Revolution, it led to improved corn varieties growing in places such as even Southern America, Africa, Eastern and Southern Africa, and increased corn production in England as well. We're also talking about high yielding varieties, where crops and strains like wheat and rice, they are more improved and developed through crossbreeding of selected varieties which have favorable characteristics. An example is increased resistance to pests and disasters, where lesser crops are damaged, so there is an increased crop yield. Oh, my back hurts. So crops are also able to grow during shorter growing seasons, so there are more harvests within a year. There's increased crop yield as well. One example is the wonder rice. So basically the rice can grow for 120 days instead of 100 days. We're also talking about IR36, with the maturation period of 105 days instead of 130 days for previous high yielding varieties, and 150 days for traditional varieties of rice. Now we're going to talk about fertilizers and pesticides. So fertilizers are of course chemicals that provide nutrients for healthy plant growth to the soil, which do have their consequences as well, by the way. And it's so they have a continuous use of farmlands, and nutrients are depleted eventually if not given. If the soil are not given a chance to fallow, and there is a smaller crop yield, fertilizers, however, when added to the soil, they'll bring back nutrients to the soil, which can encourage longer season of crop growth. And pesticides, of course, they are there to kill insects chemicals that threaten the thriving of crops. For example, we are talking about the pesticide Maladon, which was widely used in the 1980s too because of the fruit fly invasion in California, USA, in fruit orchards in California, USA. Okay, so now we are going to talk about even herbicides, where they are used to kill weeds and other undesirable plants that compete with crops for resources. We are talking about improved irrigation, which means that this increases food productivity because it supplies water to land that are too dry for farming, and it increases the amount of arable land from farming, so that more crops can be grown and there will be an increased crop yield. An example is the Great Man-Made River in Libya, where a network of underground pipes, canals, wells, reservoirs and tunnels that draws water from underground aquifers deep in the Sahara Desert, and it channels a supply of water to coastal cities for agriculture and other uses, make it possible for crops to grow in the Sahara Desert. So because of this great man-made river in Libya, there are a lot of more networks for water to be transported so that the Sahara Desert can grow crops as well. We're talking about mechanization as well because it has tools such as tractors and crop harvesters, which do harvest crops in more efficiently. This will increase crop productivity, which will get more work done instead of manual work done, which is slower. Okay, so for the last one, we're going to talk about why food shortages still occur. Physical reasons, because we have climate change, of course. The melting of glaciers in areas like Antarctica, this will lead to farmers having more water because of the melting glaciers, more water to grow crops, which may be a good thing, but it's not a good thing because scientists have predicted that all the glaciers would melt entirely by 2035, which will result in loss of water during dry seasons. And so basically it provides more irrigation during the dry season when the glaciers melt. But of course the consequences, the loss of water during dry seasons, because they're gonna melt entirely by 2035, which will lead to smaller harvests for farmers. And when global temperatures rise, some countries and regions across the world will see their current food production decrease up to 50%. So staple food producers such as Brazil, India, Philippines, Turkey, they will all suffer because they produce staple foods, but because of the rise in global temperatures, it will lead to the decrease in food production. However, some countries do experience production increase because these countries are usually the countries that staple food producers that are very cold, like Canada, for example. So because Canada is very cold all year round, it's because of climate change. They have rising temperatures that they can, properly grow. Even if they have greenhouses, they can grow the crops because they have longer summer seasons and hotter seasons. Next, physical, we are talking about not only climate change but extreme weather events. So unpredicted, cold waves, droughts, typhoons, cyclones, all of these, they would damage the crops and they would damage the farms, they would damage everything. Droughts especially because they reduce the water supply available. Tropical cyclones, which will result in the flooding of farmland, destroying crops. So because of climate change, such unpredicted extreme weather events are more frequent. Pests as well is a physical factor to contribute to food shortages. So which will eat the. So even with pesticides, pests will still destroy the crops. So, for example, we have locusts, we have caterpillars. An example is Liberia, northwestern Africa. Write that down, Liberia, northwestern Africa. Where basically armyworms or caterpillars, they invaded Liberia, northwestern Africa in 2009. So these armyworms, caterpillars, they destroyed all of the crops and stuff. Okay, now we're talking about political reasons. We have civil strife because countries face conflicts, and various stakeholders, they also face conflicts because they fight over the control of resources that are important for crop growth and may result in the destruction of these resources. When we have civil war, we have wars, we have strife, we have protests, rebellions, all of these would bring damage to properties and infrastructure that actually contribute to food production, such as farms and plantations. So because of these wars, people are desperate and frustrated that they are not able to obtain food, and this results in a vicious cycle of civil strife and food shortage. So for example, during civil strife, even landmines can be planted in farmlands, and this threaten the safety of farmers, of course, which will stay back from farming, and this will lead to a decrease in the crop yield and crop production. So poor governance also results in food shortages, where poor governance such as corruption or policy errors, the inability to implement governmental policies and agricultural policies are also a result of poor governance and food shortages. So when governments prioritize other developmental needs of the country over ensuring food security, this will lead to less land area allocated for agricultural activities and smaller crop yields. An example is in 2010, the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, where government policy led to the active development of mining, a steel plant and a port, which caused 40,000 villages to lose their farmland, and these villages could not carry out subsistence farming to support themselves, and they were also too poor to afford food. So for poor governance, I repeat, that is the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh in 2010, where the governmental policy led to the active development of mining, a steel plant and a port. So because the government prioritizes other developmental needs of the country over ensuring food security, they give priority to development of mining, steel plants and other ports and infrastructure. So this will lead to the clearing of farms, and 40,000 villages actually lost their farmland because of this negligence of food security in 2010 in the state of Madhya Pradesh. Economic reasons, because the rising demand for dairy products and meat, because countries that are becoming more wealthy and experiencing economic growth, they do demand, and these are the BRIC, the top four. We have Brazil, Russia, China, India. These are the rapid rising LDCs that contribute significantly to the global economy. we're also talking about the soaring cost of fertilizers and transport. So with growing food production, the soil is drained of the nutrients, so they need more fertilizers, right? So it's exactly this high demand for fertilizers which will lead to a rise in price of the fertilizers, which will ultimately the farmers will have no choice but to pay the increased price for the fertilizers, which will lead to increased food prices. And energy costs increase as well, which will lead to transportation cost increase because they have to pay more for fuels and things like that. So example is Kazakhstan, March 2011. Kazakhstan, okay, write that down. Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, March 2011, which is a major producer of wheat, had to sell its wheat to its neighboring countries like Tajikistan at a higher price due to rise in fuel costs. So transportation, of course, because we need transport to transport food, right? So of course this will affect consumers as well, because the increase in food prices is generally transferred to consumers. So the poor may find it hard to afford higher prices of food, and this will again the cycle: malnutrition, starvation, lower productivity, and everything. Conversion of farmland to industrial crop production to produce biofuel crops, because biofuels are basically fuels that derive energy from biological carbons like corn, sugarcane, palm oil instead of fossil fuels. So because growing crops for industrial use is more profitable than growing crops for food, so many farmers, they opt to grow their crops for industrial use. So they grow corn, they grow palm oil. All of this is just for the sake of, selling them to industries so that these corn and carbon stuff can be converted into biofuels to power transportations like cars and trucks and tractors and things like that. So this will affect the food produced and food prices, because less food crops available for consumption, less land to grow food crops for consumption. A 2009 report by the US Department of Agriculture showed 25% of all food crops grown in the USA became fuel for vehicles. So a 2009 report by the US Department of Agriculture, 2009 report, US Department of Agriculture showed 25% of all food crops grown in USA have been converted to become fuel for vehicles rather than for food. So this amount of staple food crops would have been enough to feed 300 million people for a year, but no, instead of becoming food, these are tend to use as biofuels. So this does lead to a large decrease in the amount of food crops produced, food prices rise, and thus people in poorer countries, they suffer. Okay. Social, we're talking about lack of accessibility, because usually, especially in LDCs where supermarkets and shops and markets, they are very far away, spaced far apart from each other, and there are also very few food outlets, so people are unable to obtain food readily, which will lead to smaller food intake, starvation, malnutrition, lower productivity, everything links back. So other than that, of course, transport facilities are also lacking in RDCs, such as road and rail links, and a number of locations and example is in East Timor, which experiences food shortages in between harvests, and this chronic food shortage is worsened by a lack of storage facilities and difficulty accessing remote communities in the country. Rapid population growth is also a factor, as mentioned earlier in the socio-economic reasons for a disease and disease. So an example is Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, again, where they face rapid population growth and the supply cannot meet the demand. Yeah, and so it's estimated that by 2025, 75% of Sub-Saharan Africa will have to rely on food aid, and high population growth in both urban and rural areas will worsen food shortage problem. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is the effects of continuing intensification of reproduction. So we have effects on irrigation. We're talking about salinization, because if there is excessive irrigation without careful management, this will lead to the ground becoming waterlogged and roots of crops unable to obtain sufficient air, nutrients, and they will die. So an example is when irrigation water which contains salt, they evaporate from the topsoil. This will leave behind salt on the soil, and if not drained properly, this salt will accumulate on the topsoil, which will result in the soil becoming saline soil. And this saline soil